Hey, welcome to the last lecture in chapter 19. So we're going to talk about cardiac output. This is the amount of blood pumped by our ventricles every single minute. So each ventricle individually pumps the exact same amount of blood. And this helps us to determine how healthy our cardiovascular system is. And there are two variables that affect our cardiac output, heart rate and stroke volume. So heart rate is the number of beats per minute that the heart has or does. And stroke volume is the amount of blood ejected every heartbeat. So cardiac output can be identified by taking the heart rate and multiplying that by the stroke volume. A typical resting heart rate is about 75 beats per minute. So 70 to 80 is the norm. So we just say 75 heartbeats per minute. And stroke volume for a normal average adult is about 70 milliliters per beat. So if we take 75 times 70, we get 5,250 milliliters of blood being pumped through our heart ventricles every minute, or 5.25 liters. So I told you earlier in this chapter that the heart pumps at least 5 liters, or approximately 5 liters of blood, all of our blood, through the entire heart every minute. And now you can see how that works, okay? There we go. So if you have a smaller heart, and so this little pumpkin boy here has definitely a smaller heart than any of us adults, you're going to have a smaller stroke volume. And that means you're going to have a faster heart rate. Have you ever wondered why the fetus or the neonate has such a fast heart rate? Young children have faster heart rates than adults. It's because we have smaller stroke volumes. If you have a larger heart, then you can have a smaller stroke volume. A larger heart can be associated with a stronger heart as well, being athletic. And just FYI, this is my grandson. He is now almost 4 years old, but I just took that picture when he was a little tiny munchkin. Cardiac reserve then is the amount of fluid left in, the amount of blood left in your heart after a heart contraction. After the ventricles contract, there's always a little bit of fluid left. So we can figure out how much is in reserve by taking the cardiac output when we are exercising versus the cardiac output when we are resting. And that will tell us our cardiac reserve. So we have a higher stroke volume and we have a higher heart rate during exercise. In individuals that are healthy, non-athletes, the cardiac reserve can be up to 4 times that of an individual that is more unhealthy or doesn't exercise at all. If you are an athlete, then you can have up to 7 times the cardiac reserve of a non-athlete. But the opposite occurs if you have a heart that has been weakened, a heart that has undergone, say, a heart attack, or if you are never able to exercise, so you have a weakened heart because you can't exercise. That's going to cause you to have a lower cardiac reserve. What stimulates our heart rate, and our cardiac output? Or stroke volume, I should say, which then stimulates our cardiac output. There's a region in our brain in the medulla called the cardioacceleratory center, and another region in that same medulla that's called the cardioinhibitory region. So we have sympathetic nerves and parasympathetic nerves that lead from the medulla to the heart. The vagus nerve is the parasympathetic nerve that sends signals to the heart to slow down the heart rate. Then the sympathetic nerve, their sympathetic cardiac nerves, they stimulate the same region of the heart and they tell the heart to increase. We also have baroreceptors, chemoreceptors, and proprioreceptors that are going to influence if we increase or decrease the heart rate or stroke volume, the strength of that contraction. So baroreceptors are pressure receptors in our heart. If the pressure in the heart becomes too high, then that's going to cause us to have to release some of that pressure. And so if there's high pressure in the heart, then we're going to push that fluid out. If there's high pressure in our blood vessels, then that's going to slow the heart down. The heart can't push as high. And so this can occur like if you have a blockage in your blood vessels. Chemoreceptors increase, they can increase or decrease the heart rate by just looking at the amount of carbon dioxide, the pH, or the amount of oxygen. So if we have high levels of carbon dioxide in our system, that might make our heart race faster so that we can move that blood to the lungs and get rid of it. If we have low levels of carbon dioxide in our system, then we might want to slow that heart down so that carbon dioxide can get in our system, bringing our pH back to where it's supposed to be. Proprioreceptors, these are the receptors within our joints. And so if we're using our joints a lot, typically we see that during activity, then it's going to increase blood flow, cause our heart to contract faster, to get the nutrients to all of our tissues. But if we stop moving, then that's going to decrease that blood flow. So stroke volume has three main variables that influence it. We have the preload. This is the amount of blood available to be released by the ventricles. We have, and this is associated with filling time. So if we have a longer filling time, then we have more blood in our ventricles, and so more blood can leave. It also is influenced by venous return, the amount of blood that can move back to our heart via the veins. So if you have more blood moving back to the heart via the veins, then you're going to have more blood in the ventricles, and that's going to give you a larger amount of preload. And so this is going to be associated with a skeletal muscle and respiratory pumps. Then we have the contractility of the heart, so how well does our heart contract, and the afterload, which is associated with the pressure in the in the arteries. So Frank's Starling law basically states that if you have increased blood volume in the heart, then you have an increased stretch on the myocardium, which is going to increase the force of the ventricles to pump the blood out, which increases the stroke volume. So it all is associated with each other. The more blood we have returning, the more blood we can get rid of from our heart, which makes sense. So contractility, the changes that occur in the heart to make our muscle actually be able to contract better. So the more calcium that we have, the more cross bridges we can form, and the stronger the contraction can be during a muscle contraction of the heart. So contractility is often associated with the amount of calcium in our blood. And so calcium channel blockers can actually lower the amount of calcium that gets into the heart, and that can slow the heart contraction, which causes less blood to be released, and that might lower blood pressure. Positive inotropic agents can increase contractility. So anything that increases calcium in the blood is going to increase contractility. Negative inotropic agents are going to decrease contractility. And again, these are mainly going to be looking at calcium again. So calcium channel blockers are going to decrease contractility. And then afterload would be the resistance of the arteries or semilunar valves to the ejection of blood. So if the arteries have a high pressure due to maybe blockage in the arteries, if you have atherosclerosis, that can cause the pressure in the arteries to be higher and then less blood can leave. If you have damage to your semilunar valves where they don't like to open properly, then that can also cause blood to not be able to leave properly. And so this is a table from your textbook, and it just shows factors that impact either the preload, the contractility, or the afterload. So you can read this on your own. This is a table from your textbook that, why does it say 10-1? This is a table that talks about factors that increase heart rate and force of contraction. And then here is the second part of that table that shows the decreasing the heart rate and force of contraction. The last thing we're going to talk about then is the development of the heart. The heart starts forming during embryonic development. So it is the very first functional organ that we have. It forms before our nervous system. So our heart is beating before we have any neural innervation because the SA node is a pacemaker of its own self. And so it forms from the mesoderm of the embryo, and it starts beating at around day 21. So it's formed pretty much. We form that embryo and the heart starts forming at the same time, and we have a heartbeat by around day 21. By the time the heart is about 4 weeks, or by the time the embryo is 28 days old, we have the 4 basic chambers starting to show. And by 8 weeks, we can see the foraminovale. We see those valves formed. And so, we're getting all of these structures that are going to allow nutrients to flow properly. Some disorders associated with the heart that we often see in neonates, one of them is this foraminovale not closing properly. So we have a hole in the heart. When this happens, typically within the first 24 hours, that hole, that foraminovale that's opened, that allows blood to flow from the right to the left atrium, as soon as the baby takes its first breath, that foramen is pushed closed, and so it seals up within the first 24 hours. Sometimes that doesn't happen, and so you have mixing of blood. And that's what we're seeing here. We have coarctation of the aorta. So we have a narrowing of the aorta when it moves out, and that causes problems with blood flow to all of our body tissues. Patent ductus arteriosus. This would be where the ductus arteriosus does not close up. So again, this is one of those regions that allowed for nutrient-rich blood that was entering the pulmonary circulation to go directly into the aorta and go to the body, because again, the lungs don't work in a fetus. So if this doesn't close, though, we're getting oxygen poor blood going into the aorta, and it's causing all kinds of problems. And then tetralogy of Fallot includes abnormal opening in the interventricular septum. So here it's like a hole between the interventricular septum. So we have mixing of blood, and here you can see blood is able to go directly out into the aorta because we have that mixing of blood. And so the blood that enters the aorta is going to be, instead of oxygen rich, it's going to be oxygen mixed, and it's going to cause problems. At this point, you have finished the last lecture in chapter 19, so that should feel pretty good. 2 chapters down, only a few left to go through. I'll get these posted and we'll get into chapter 20 shortly. Bye.